To trace the origins of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, we must return to the era of the Second World War, when both the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as new superpowers. United under the common threat of fascist aggression, they forged a partnership that transcended differences in social systems and ideologies. Yet as the war drew to its close, deep divisions surfaced over the construction of a new world order and the allocation of national interests. Throughout the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union suffered nearly 27 million lives lost and a quarter of its national wealth destroyed. Determined never again to face invasion, the Soviets placed paramount importance on erecting an unbreakable security barrier in the post-war years. The Eastern European nations liberated by the Red Army, under Soviet influence, embraced the socialist path and became satellite states. Even so, Stalin never abandoned the vision of peaceful coexistence with America, believing that despite divergent economic and ideological systems, such systems could coexist, and that peaceful resolution of U.S.-Soviet differences was not only possible, but essential for universal peace. The march of history, however, seldom follows noble designs. The Soviet security strategy inevitably collided with America's drive for global dominance. American leaders viewed the Soviet Union and the socialist tide it carried as a monstrous flood, gripped by profound fear of surging revolutionary movements worldwide. In the immediate post-war years, Europe lay shattered by conflict, Britain's empire in eclipse, creating a historic opening. America, its economic and military might unrivaled and sole possessor of the atomic bomb, stepped forward to lead the Western world. On March 5, 1946, the Iron Curtain speech marked the first open expression of Western hostility toward the Soviet Union. Carefully orchestrated by President Truman and delivered through British lips, it voiced America's unspoken resolve and paved the way for the Truman Doctrine. 1 year later, revolutions erupted in Greece and Turkey, with communist-led guerrillas on the verge of seizing power, prompting an emergency session of the U.S. Congress. War-ravaged Europe faced mass unemployment and relentless workers, uprisings, fueling the rapid rise of communist parties across the West. In under a decade, membership surged from 500,000 in 1939 to 4 million by 1947. We believed that should Greece fall to communist control, Turkey and the entire Middle East would follow in a domino cascade, reaching far into both East and West. Under this pressure, America chose to reveal its hand. On March 12, 1947, President Truman addressed Congress, declaring the containment of communism the guiding principle of American politics, ideology, and foreign policy. This became known as the Truman Doctrine. Under its banner, the United States armed the Greek government with money and weapons, ultimately crushing the People's Revolution. Throughout the Cold War, the Truman Doctrine remained the cornerstone of American diplomacy, though its essence was nothing less than interference in the sovereign affairs of other nations. Posing as guardian of the free world, America meddled at will in the affairs of sovereign nations, branding every threat to Western order as communist agitation, while refusing to acknowledge the rot within capitalism itself. Such was the deeper poison of the Truman Doctrine. Its proclamation heralded the formal opening of the Cold War between the capitalist bloc led by the United States and the socialist camp under Soviet leadership. In lockstep on the economic front, America unleashed the Marshall Plan in 1947, the grand design to resurrect Europe. From 1948 to 1952, Western nations received $13 billion in aid, 90% outright gifts, 10% loans, gifts in all but name. Was America moved by charity? Hardly. The plan let Washington seize the reins of Europe's politics and economy, chaining the continent to American markets, while dumping surplus wartime production overseas. Europe stood on the Cold War's bleeding edge. Its revival bolstered the capitalist fortress. The verdict of history is clear: the Marshall Plan triumphed. Western Europe clawed back from ruin. Between 1948 and 1952, industrial output leapt 35%, matching pre-war levels by the plan's end, and igniting 2 decades of blistering growth. Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan together forged America's twin blades of global hegemony in politics and economics, shaping Washington's foreign strategy for over 4 decades. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe through purges and the Molotov Plan. Ideological chasms guaranteed collision. The first thunderous clash came in 1948 with the Berlin Crisis. Nazi Germany, architect of the Second World War, lay defeated. America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union carved the Reich into occupation zones. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet sector, was itself quartered. This fractured geography planted the seeds of repeated crises. On Germany's fate, the superpowers stood poles apart. Soviet blood and treasure demanded reparations. The Potsdam Agreement entitled Moscow to extract them from all zones. The Kremlin sought a unified Germany under coordinated economic policy to secure its due. Washington wanted Germany sundered, its western half a bulwark against the red tide. In March 1948, the American, British, and French zones merged. In June, the West launched currency reform and issued new marks, unilateral moves that enraged Moscow and set the stage for blockade. The Soviet Union imposed a total blockade on Berlin, severing all road, rail, and waterway links to the western sectors, while leaving only 3 air corridors open from West Germany. Thus began the First Berlin Crisis. America answered with overwhelming air power, mounting a colossal airlift that daily delivered food and supplies to 2.5 million West Berliners, while imposing a counter-blockade on coal, steel, and electricity to the Soviet zone. As months dragged on, the airlift's costs soared, and the counter-blockade starved Soviet industry of vital Western goods and raw materials. Both giants were forced back to the table. On May 12, 1949, Moscow lifted the blockade. The near-year-long crisis ended, but it proved the superpowers could never agree on Germany's fate and hastened the country's division. On September 20, 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was born in the West. On October 7th, the German Democratic Republic rose in the East. A once unified nation now stood cleaved by utterly opposed political systems and ideologies. At the same moment, both sides forged their military alliances. On April 4, 1949, America and its Western partners signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington. NATO was born. On May 14, 1955, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe countered with the Warsaw Pact in Poland's capital. 2 rival blocs now faced off in frozen military confrontation. Germany remained the flashpoint of early Cold War collision in Europe. Further crises erupted in 1958 and 1961. West Berlin, embedded deep inside East German territory yet garrisoned by American, British, and French troops, was seen by Moscow and East Berlin as a dagger plunged into the socialist heartland. Western spy agencies swarmed the city. The most infamous operation, the Berlin Tunnel, built jointly by the CIA and British intelligence. They tapped Soviet underground cables, running 600 recorders around the clock and burning through 800 tapes daily to harvest priceless secrets. The tunnel was exposed in 1956. For security, the Soviets demanded the Western garrisons withdraw. The demand was rebuffed. West Berlin's superior economy lured waves of East Germans westward, draining the East of labor and threatening its stability. West Berlin posed a direct menace to East German political security, economic growth, and social order. On August 15, 1961, East German authorities began erecting the Berlin Wall along the sector border to staunch the human tide. The crises ended this way. The wall became not merely the symbol of Germany's division, but of Europe's and the world's, the starkest monument to Cold War confrontation. Thus originated and hardened the U.S.-Soviet Cold War in Europe after World War II. Now we turn our gaze to the opposite side of the globe, to Asia. In 1949, a seismic event shook the continent. The Chinese Communist Party led the people to triumphant victory in the Democratic Revolution. The People's Republic of China was proclaimed, a milestone in the global communist movement second only to the October Revolution, profoundly reshaping the world's political map. On February 14, 1950, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance was signed, forging unbreakable bonds across politics, economy, military, and culture. China's entry fused the socialist bloc into a solid Eurasian front. The Cold War now stretched from the Atlantic to the Western Pacific, a truly global struggle. In 1950, the clash between capitalism and socialism reached the Korean Peninsula. Bordering China and the Soviet Union to the north and facing Japan across the sea, Korea's geography made it the ultimate shield for continental defense or spearhead for maritime assault. For centuries, a prize coveted by great powers, a vital strategic buffer, modern history saw 3 wars fought over its fate. In 1894, the Sino-Japanese War ended China's suzerainty after Qing defeat. The 1904 Russo-Japanese War crushed Russia and tightened Tokyo's grip. By 1910, the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty swallowed Korea whole, turning the peninsula into a Japanese colony. When Japan surrendered in 1945, America and the Soviet Union divided the land along the 38th parallel. The North, under Soviet trusteeship, became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The South, under American trusteeship, the Republic of Korea. Like Germany, the peninsula split into two nations of irreconcilable ideology and system. After foreign troops withdrew, both Koreas sought unification. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War erupted. In the opening blitz, North Korean forces swept south, capturing Seoul in 3 days and over 90% of the peninsula within weeks. America saw communism surging across Asia, a mortal threat to the West. On September 15, 1950, UN forces led by the United States landed at Incheon. The tide turned. By October, U.S. ROK troops crossed the 38th parallel and drove to the Chinese border. China's security was now imperiled. To defend the homeland, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army crossed the Yalu. After 5 brutal campaigns, Chinese forces hurled the enemy back to the 38th parallel and forced America to the table. On July 27, 1953, the Korean armistice was signed at Panmunjom. The Korean War was the first large-scale hot war of the Cold War, a civil conflict that drew in China, America, the Soviet Union, and others. America had won total victory in both world wars, yet 3 years on this narrow peninsula yielded only stalemate. The shock forced Washington to reckon with China's might. As America exhaled over the armistice, it little suspected a far deeper abyss awaited in Asia. From 1885 to 1940, Vietnam languished as a French colony. In 1940, France fell to Germany. Japan marched in. After Japan's defeat, Ho Chi Minh led the Vietnamese people to declare the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2, 1945. The French colonialists returned with vengeance, scheming to reclaim Vietnam. On April 27, 1949, they propped up the exiled emperor to establish the Bao Dai regime in the south. 9 years of anti-French resistance culminated on May 7, 1954, when Vietnamese forces encircled and crushed the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu. On July 21st, the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel into North and South. As France withdrew, America stepped in, bankrolling the South and installing the anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem. From 1955 to 1961, Washington poured roughly $200 million annually into South Vietnam, plus mountains of arms, yet the regime tottered. Dissent swelled. When Kennedy took office in 1961, he resolved to prove American resolve against communism in Vietnam. Military advisors surged. Green Berets landed, marking the first American boots in the quagmire. But no escalation could hide the Saigon government's rot. As Kennedy fretted over mounting rebellion, fire erupted in America's own backyard. On October 14, 1962, U-2 spy planes photographed Soviet medium and intermediate-range missile sites under construction in Cuba. The Cold War reached fever pitch, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fiercest superpower showdown yet. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution toppled Batista. By 1961, severed from Washington, Havana turned to Moscow for economic and military aid. Khrushchev seized the chance. With American Jupiter missiles already menacing the Soviet heartland from Turkey and Italy, Cuba offered perfect strategic counterweight. Soviet technicians, medium-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, nuclear bombers, and fighters poured secretly into the island. The ruse held until October 14th. U-2 imagery revealed the launchers. Follow-up flights on October 17th confirmed missiles with 3 700-kilometer range, capable of striking every major American city, including Washington, with only 5 minutes warning. On October 18th, generals demanded immediate airstrikes. On October 20th, Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine. On October 22nd, he addressed the nation, exposing Soviet nuclear deployment and announcing the blockade, demanding removal of the offensive weapons. American forces worldwide went to DEFCON 3, nuclear-armed B-52s prowled Cuban skies. The Cuban Missile Crisis reached its white-hot zenith. World War III hung by a thread. The specter of nuclear annihilation darkened the globe. America's iron response stunned the Kremlin. Khrushchev had misjudged both U.S. intelligence and Kennedy's steel, yet he stood firm. On October 23rd, Soviet forces went to full combat alert and missile construction accelerated. Next day, 90 American warships ringed Cuba. U.S. missile crews stood ready at their silos. The largest invasion force since World War II massed on American soil. On October 25th, Soviet vessels neared the quarantine line. Kennedy, nerves frayed, could not predict whether they would submit to inspection or if his own commanders would obey restraint. Khrushchev paced, fearing a submarine captain might fire first. After tense probing, Moscow ordered civilian cargoes to proceed without boarding, while missile ships turned back to safe waters. Kennedy reciprocated. No intercepts beyond the line. On October 26th, a rambling letter from Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles if America pledged never to invade Cuba. Just as tempers cooled, stray shots on October 27th reignited panic. Outnumbered in warheads, Khrushchev dreaded escalation. Kennedy likewise preferred losing Turkish bases to Armageddon. Neither wanted apocalypse. On October 28th, Khrushchev broadcast withdrawal from Cuba. Kennedy quietly agreed to dismantle the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Both superpowers pulled nuclear fangs from the other's throat, claimed victory, and averted catastrophe. A grim but satisfactory draw. With the crisis behind it, America plunged deeper into Vietnam. Despite billions in aid and thousands of advisors, by 1964, Saigon's armies reeled. On March 2, 1965, President Johnson unleashed Operation Rolling Thunder, massive bombing of the North. American combat troops followed. China and the Soviet Union armed Hanoi. Burned by Korea, U.S. forces never crossed the 17th parallel. Viet Cong guerrillas bled the South from northern sanctuaries. Vietnam became a bottomless pit, swallowing American blood and treasure. By 1973, Washington began withdrawal. In 1976, Ho Chi Minh's forces unified the nation. Vietnam cost America 360,000 casualties and $250 billion, a staggering price for defeat. The war shattered the home front and crippled the economy. From Berlin to Cuba, Korea to Vietnam, America had always held the upper hand. But as Vietnam bled the nation white, the Soviet Union raced ahead in strategic nuclear arms, catching and then surpassing the United States. The Cold War balance shattered. From the late 1960s, the tide turned decisively. Vietnam sapped American strength. Foreign policy contracted. Meanwhile, Moscow, chastened by Cuba, closed the nuclear gap. In July 1964, America fielded 834 ICBMs to the Soviet 190. By November 1969, the tally stood 4-1, 140. The Kremlin now vied for global supremacy. Yet just as the guard changed, fracture split the socialist giants. After the People's Republic was proclaimed on October 1, 1949, Moscow was first to recognize Beijing. From 1950 to 1957, the honeymoon flourished. Soviet aid in politics, industry, and arms poured in. Entire industrial systems were transplanted. The first five-year plan succeeded, laying China's industrial foundation. The two were brothers in arms, but Moscow's meddling grew. In 1958, the Kremlin demanded long-wave radio stations on Chinese soil and a joint fleet that would have swallowed China's infant navy. Mao rejected both as assaults on sovereignty. Cracks widened. In 1960, Moscow abruptly recalled every expert and tore up every agreement, inflicting massive economic damage and wounding Chinese pride. Border disputes flared. Brezhnev's 1964 ascent hardened the line. Soviet divisions massed along the frontier. In March 1969, armed clash erupted at Zhenbao Island. Chinese border guards repelled the incursion. Moscow raged, threatening surgical nuclear strikes to erase the Chinese menace once and for all. Crisis eased only after secret September talks between Kosygin and Zhou Enlai. Soviet troops remained. China now faced both superpowers alone, a strategic nightmare. Ideology yielded to survival. Shared interests in checking Soviet expansion aligned Beijing and Washington. The thaw began. In April 1971, the U.S. table tennis team visited China, the first American group in the People's Republic since 1949. Ping-pong diplomacy cracked open a door sealed for 22 years. On February 21, 1972, beneath a chill Beijing sky, Nixon's Air Force One touched down. The president descended, hand extended, and clasped Premier Zhou Enlai's in a grip that shook the world. Nixon later wrote, "When our hands met, one era ended and another began." Nixon became the first American president to set foot on Chinese soil. The rupture of the Sino-Soviet alliance and the thaw with America birthed the Beijing-Moscow-Washington strategic triangle. China's tilt toward one superpower or the other now tipped the global balance. This triangle shaped not only foreign policies, but domestic shifts in each nation. Sino-American rapprochement and eventual diplomatic ties cleared the path for China's reform and opening. As America retreated, the Soviet Union surged. The 1970s crowned Moscow's economic and military ascent. Nuclear arsenals surpassed Washington's. Trade boomed. Reserves swelled. Foreign aid became a lever to extend political reach. Emboldened, the Kremlin embarked on sweeping expansion. From 1971, it signed friendship treaties with Egypt, India, Iraq, Vietnam, Ethiopia, and 7 others, turning them into Soviet satellites and meddling brazenly in the Third World until the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan marked the zenith of overreach and the turning point from rise to ruin, dragging the USSR into a decade-long quagmire. Afghanistan straddles West, South, and Central Asia, the crossroads of continents and ancient trade routes. Reviving Tsarist dreams of warm water ports, Moscow aimed to punch through to the Indian Ocean and encircle Europe and the Middle East. In 1973, the monarchy fell. The Dowd regime leaned Moscow, but played east against west, lighting American cigarettes with Soviet matches. Growing U.S. contacts enraged the Kremlin. In April 1978, the People's Democratic Party seized power. Taraki became president. Within a year, his deputy Amin ousted and killed him, then pursued independent diplomacy and warmed to Washington. This crossed Moscow's red line. Afghanistan was too vital to lose. On December 25th, Soviet paratroopers and armor poured into Kabul. On December 27th, KGB and Spetsnaz executed Operation Storm 333. 700 commandos stormed the Dar-el-Aman Palace, liquidated Amin, and seized government, military, and media centers. Afghans awoke to Soviet tanks rumbling through Kabul, stunned by the lightning coup, and grasped that their nation now bowed to a foreign puppet. The Soviet Blitz opened triumphantly. From December 28th, 6 divisions struck in a pincer from east and west, linking at Kandahar on January 2nd. Within a week, key cities, bases, and arteries fell under Red Army control. Yet resistance ignited across the countryside. Guerrillas, masters of the jagged highlands that blanket 4/5 of the land, bled the invaders. Tanks bogged in narrow passes. Mechanized columns became sitting targets. America, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan funneled cash and arms to the Mujahideen. Moscow's lightning war curdled into a decade-long hemorrhage. By 1989, economic collapse forced total withdrawal. Afghanistan mirrored Vietnam. 50,000 Soviet casualties, $20 billion squandered. Endless drain and domestic rot sapped the empire. The 1979 invasion became the catalyst for Soviet disintegration. That same year, an elder on China's southern coast drew a circle in the sand, sketching the grand blueprint of reform and opening. China embarked on socialism with Chinese characteristics, a path true to its own soil. Across the 1980s, most socialist states groped for reform, yet divergent roads yielded opposite fates. The socialist world's upheaval sealed the Cold War's end. To fathom the final decade, we must ask why these nations sought change. By the 1980s, Soviet growth crawled, living standards stagnated. National income growth slid from 7.8% 1966-1970 to 5.7%, then 4.8%, and a limp 3.6% 1981-1985. Industrial and agricultural output withered. Farm growth scraped 1%. The Brezhnev era earned the name stagnation. Rooted in the ossified Stalin model, every system has strengths and flaws. Stalin's model, forged in desperate times, once served survival, but post-war peace demanded adaptation. Moscow clung to rigid central planning, administrative fiat, monolithic public ownership, and disdain for markets. Heavy and defense industries devoured resources, while light industry and agriculture starved. At the USSR's birth, the world bayed for its blood, plotting to strangle the Bolshevik infant. Facing siege and invasion, the Stalinist blueprint forged a fortress. The first and second 5-year plans rocketed the Soviet Union from agrarian backwater to industrial titan. Industrial output ranked first in Europe, second worldwide, forging the sinews that crushed Nazi invasion. Yet, peace exposed the model's deformities. Warped priorities starved agriculture and consumer goods. Command economics that scorned markets bred waste, apathy, and chronic shortages. The 1979 Afghan quagmire invited Western economic warfare. Washington colluded with OPEC to crash oil prices. From $34 a barrel in 1983 to $29, then a catastrophic $10 by 1986. Oil, the Kremlin's cash cow, hemorrhaged revenue, while the economy shrank. Military spending ballooned under Brezhnev's late expansionism and arms race. By 1985, defense devoured 13.1% of GNP against America's 6.4%, an unsustainable yoke. Society festered. Breadlines snaked through cities. Women queued for milk and soap. Corruption calcified the elite. Despair poisoned the air. Leadership knew reform was life or death. 3 general secretaries died in rapid succession from 1982 to 1985. Into the breach stepped a young Mikhail Gorbachev. Hailed as savior in March 1985, history judges him the architect of ruin. Economic reform came first, and the first step was a misstep, the upside-down acceleration strategy. Instead of rebalancing heavy and light industry, it doubled down on the former, grotesquely distorting proportions. Growth stalled, shelves emptied, panic buying erupted at every rumor. By 1988, Gorbachev blamed not policy but the political system, pivoting to radical overhaul. At the 19th Party Conference, he proclaimed total political transformation, pluralism of opinion, criticism without limits. Chaos erupted. Over 500 parties and 60,000 unofficial groups mushroomed. Opposition and Western agents fanned the flames. These splinter groups became lightning rods for public fury, thrusting the Communist Party into the crosshairs. The reforms veered catastrophically from Marxism and socialism, a disguised capitulation to capitalism. Loosening ideology proved fatal. Without a unifying creed, power struggles tore the party apart. Factions crystallized. Gorbachev's mainstream versus Yeltsin's radicals. In early 1990, radicals seized legislatures across republics and open elections. Yeltsin was elected chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet. In March, Gorbachev amended the constitution, ending the party's monopoly, legalizing multi-party politics, and creating the presidency. He became the USSR's first and last president. Radicals allied with separatists, staged strikes, and marched for new government and Gorbachev's ouster. By 1991, Yeltsin won Russia's presidency on June 12th, and on July 20th, banned party cells in state organs, enterprises, and the military. Western peaceful evolution accelerated collapse. Since the Cold War's dawn, America had waged cultural warfare through media and infiltration. In the 1980s crisis, propaganda intensified. Citizens contrasted socialist gloom with curated Western glamour. Youth, especially, abandoned communism for democracy and freedom. As Moscow lost grip, Eastern Europe slipped away. Debt, stagnation, corruption, and Western allure mirrored the USSR's ills. From 1989, socialist regimes toppled one by one. The Berlin Wall fell in 1990. Germany reunified. By 1991, Gorbachev's reforms spun out of control. Conservatives gambled on a coup to save the Union. At dawn on August 19, 1991, as the Kremlin clock struck 6, Vice President Yanayev announced on national television that Gorbachev was incapacitated by illness and he was assuming presidential powers. A 6-month state of emergency was declared. An 8-man state committee for the state of emergency, drawn from top security and government posts, issued an appeal to the Soviet people. The bombshell stunned the nation. Gorbachev was vacationing on the Black Sea. The emergency committee placed Gorbachev under house arrest, severing all contact with the outside world. Rumors swirled that the president was dead. At 11 a.m., the committee issued its first decree, demanding absolute compliance with the emergency across all levels of government. Radicals defied it. At 11:46 a.m., Yeltsin held a press conference at the Russian White House, branding the committee illegal in an appeal to Russian citizens. At 12:15, he climbed atop a tank sent to crush protesters and, without amplification, declared all committee orders void in Russia. Television beamed the image nationwide, casting Yeltsin as the fearless champion and rallying masses to his banner. On August 20th, Yeltsin phoned President Bush, securing Western condemnation of the coup. America, Britain, France, and Germany united in denunciation, encircling the plotters. In hindsight, neutralizing Yeltsin at the outset might have altered history. By the time the committee woke to the danger, it was too late. Yeltsin's prestige was sky high. Wavering officers defected to his command. On August 21st, Russia's vice president retrieved Gorbachev from Crimea. At 9 p.m., Gorbachev declared full control restored and his imminent return to duty. On August 22nd, the 8 coup leaders were arrested. Though freed, Gorbachev was eclipsed. Yeltsin now ruled Moscow. In 72 hours, the putsch by the Soviet elite collapsed. It was the conservatives' final desperate bid to save the Union. The next day, Yeltsin banned all Communist Party activity in Russia. On August 24th, Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary. On November 6th, the 20 million-member CPSU was dissolved. The central regime's foundation crumbled. Nationalism surged. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus declared the USSR defunct and formed the Commonwealth of Independent States. The other republics followed. 15 nations emerged from the wreckage. At 7:40 p.m. on Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev resigned the presidency. The red flag that had flown over the Kremlin for 69 years was lowered forever. The world's first socialist state breathed its last. The Cold War ended not with fire but with the Soviet implosion. Across nearly half a century, nuclear terror kept direct superpower war at bay. Compared to the world wars, carnage, a cold peace was progress. Yet the scramble for global hegemony spawned proxy wars and regional infernos that scorched the Third World. Ideology carved nations in two: East and West Germany, North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam, all children of the Cold War. The Korean divide endures, a live wire menacing regional peace. Unlike old imperial rivalries, the superpowers fought not just for power, but to prove whose system reigned supreme. Gorbachev's reforms betrayed that ideal, abandoned socialism, and plunged the nation into chaos. They delivered no hope, only ruin and lost faith, culminating in dissolution. China's ascent stands in stark contrast. Different paths yielded opposite destinies. Through trial and error, we forged socialism with Chinese characteristics. Reform unleashed the system's vitality. Growth outpaced the globe, a miracle that stunned the world. Rising power expands our global voice. America now eyes China as the new rival. Talk of a new Cold War swirls. China seeks peace, not hegemony, and harms no nation's interests. Yet provocations against our sovereignty will meet unyielding resolve. The future is veiled, but the Soviet collapse teaches vigilance. We must prepare for whatever storms may come.